All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys sent in your sources, and we've done the work, and we're ready to bring you the key insights. So today we are diving deep into the Canadian federal election, which, by the way, is happening on April 28th. So mark your calendars for that one.
And as your sources point out, this isn't just your typical election. I mean, this campaign's unfolding under some pretty, what some are calling unprecedented circumstances. We've got trade wars. We've got the U.S. president himself making direct comments about Canada. So it's a pretty unique backdrop.
Yeah, it's definitely not business as usual, is it? And, while we've got the usual domestic issues like healthcare and the economy, it just seems like this whole conversation is being framed by Canada's relationship with the U.S. It kind of makes you wonder, what does this election mean for Canada's place in the world?
Right, that's the big question. So for this deep dive, I think our mission is to sort of go beyond the headlines and really unpack the key factors that are influencing this election. I mean, what choices are Canadians facing as they go to the polls in this pretty unique environment?
Exactly. You're tuning in because you want a clear picture of what's happening and why it matters. So let's get into it. And I think a good place to start would be with, well, what a lot of sources are calling the Trump effect.
Yeah, I think to understand this, we have to kind of lay the groundwork first. The relationship between Canada and the U.S. has traditionally been very deep, very intertwined. I mean, you've got highly integrated economies, decades of this security partnership and that famously long and undefended border. It's really been a cornerstone of stability and prosperity for both countries, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. But as we've all seen, a lot of President Trump's actions have kind of shaken that foundation. I mean, we've got the use of tariffs, that the kind of economic leverage. We've got him calling the border an artificially drawn line. And there's just this general sense of unpredictability now. It's a pretty stark departure from the norm.
Yeah, no, totally. One of your sources actually quotes Marcy Surcase. She's a former policy director. And she says it's impossible to overstate the impact of the president's actions on Canadian politics, on Canadian psyche, on Canadian business. And that really, I think, underscores how deeply disruptive all this has been. It goes way beyond just trade figures. It's almost like touching on national identity, isn't it?
It really is. And that's probably why a lot of the sources emphasize that this election feels as much about navigating the relationship with the U.S. as it does about domestic policy,
Excellent.
right? And I mean, the fact that all the party leaders made these U.S. threats a core part of their campaign launch events on Sunday, that speaks volumes.
It does. And the thing is, there's more to come. The White House is expected to announce another round of global tariffs on April 2nd. That's right in the thick of the campaign. And with that sort of hanging over the Canadian economy, it's bound to, keep the U.S. relationship front and center for voters, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. I mean, how can you not think about that, right? And
Yeah.
I think we're already seeing how this external pressure is playing out. What was initially looking like a clear lead for the Conservatives has really tightened up. It's basically a toss-up now with the Liberals. And it really suggests that this whole U.S. situation, the uncertainty around it, it's a huge motivator for people.
For sure. And then you got Trump himself, wading into Canadian politics. I mean, his comments on Fox News where he called the conservative leader, stupidly, no friend of mine, and then suggested that a liberal might be easier to deal with, even though he said it doesn't matter to him.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of commentary is unusual, right? It's clearly aimed at influencing public opinion, and it just adds another layer of complexity for Canadian voters.
Definitely. So with all this U.S. unpredictability and, direct presidential commentary, one core question emerges for voters, at least according to the sources you sent. Who is best equipped to handle this unpredictable U.S. president? So let's get into the who's who in this election and how the main contenders are talking about standing up for Canada.
Right. So the main event here is obviously the race between Liberal Mark Carney and Conservative Pierre Poilievre. Now, we do have other parties in the mix, the NDP, Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, and the People's Party. But the reality of Canadian politics is that it's really been dominated by the Liberals and the Conservatives. So that's the main dynamic to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's the key matchup. And it's interesting because these two leaders come from such different backgrounds. Carney, the former central banker, he's actually pretty new to politics. He stepped into the prime minister role after Trudeau resigned, which makes him the first PM who wasn't initially elected to parliament. So he's got this global economic experience, but he's never run a campaign before. And with the Liberals in such a precarious position, his tenure could be very short-lived if they don't pull this off. What kind of pressure do you think that puts on a leader?
Oh, that's a great point. I mean, he doesn't have a personal mandate, and this election is so urgent, it really raises the stakes for him. And then you contrast that with Poilievre. I mean, he's a total veteran of Canadian politics. Elected at 25, he spent 2 decades in federal politics, including cabinet roles. He's really known for his political savvy, and he's been very effective at tapping into voter concerns around things like inflation and immigration.
And it's interesting how his messaging has evolved. I mean, that shift from Canada's broken to Canada first seems very deliberate, right? It's all about projecting strength and resolve in the face of all these U.S. challenges. One of your sources, it was Marcy Surkis again, calls him the consummate retail politician, but she wonders if his brand, his narrative really fits this moment. Maybe what people need now is a more unifying message.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because on the other side, you've got Carney going directly at the U.S. issue. He said that Trump wants to break us so America can own us, which is a pretty strong statement. It's like he's framing the election as this defense of Canadian sovereignty. Do you think that resonates with people?
It definitely gets your attention, doesn't it? And even Poilievre, with his Canada First slogan, he's also emphasizing the importance of independence and sovereignty. He's saying he'll stand up to the U.S. when necessary. So they're both trying to project strength, but maybe through different lenses. One's more about direct confrontation, the other is about domestic strength. It's an interesting contrast.
It is. And Carney's even trying to tie Poilievre directly to Trump. He's saying that Poilievre's echoing Trump on cutting foreign aid, that they're using similar language and intent, and that's clearly a strategy to link his opponent to this negative influence from the South.
Yeah.
But do Canadian voters really see a parallel there? I mean, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that leads us to the next big topic here. What are the competing visions for Canada in this election? Our sources are suggesting that this goes beyond the typical policy debates. It's about these fundamental questions, Canada's sovereignty and how to navigate the future, especially with an ally that's so unpredictable.
It's striking how this election seems less about domestic issues than we've seen in a long time. I mean, one of your sources makes a comparison to the 1988 election, which was all about the debate over NAFTA and had those same anxieties about sovereignty and economic independence. It seems like whenever there's this heightened concern about Canada's place in North America, it just, reshapes the political conversation.
And you know what's interesting? Both the Liberals and Conservatives, they're both talking about economic growth. They're talking about building more housing, advancing energy and resource projects, strengthening defense. They both seem to agree on being ready to retaliate against more U.S. tariffs. So there's this fundamental agreement on protecting Canada's interests, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, they both agree that Canada needs a strong domestic economy and that they have to be ready to stand up for its interests, especially against this external pressure. But where they differ is how to do that. Their approaches are totally different.
Right. So Carney, leading the Liberals, he's kind of moved the party more towards the center. He's promising to spend less and invest more, specifically in things like housing, military infrastructure, and the tech sector, computing. So it's more of a targeted investment strategy.
And Poilievre, with the Conservatives, he's going for a more classic fiscal conservative approach. So smaller government, cutting red tape, cutting taxes, and he says that'll boost industry, infrastructure, and housing. They're also focusing a lot more on crime. So it's really a different philosophy on how to achieve growth and address social issues. But now both of those are framed within this backdrop of U.S. economic uncertainty.
Exactly. But, even with all this focus on the U.S., we can't ignore the lingering cost of living concerns, right? I mean, affordability, housing, healthcare, these are still massive issues for Canadians.
Oh, absolutely. And one pollster, David Coletto, he makes a really interesting point. He says that even though these bread and butter issues are important, they've kind of been overshadowed by this, existential threat of the trade war. And he says Trump and tariffs are really what's driving the national psyche right now, which is, it's pretty insightful, isn't it? It suggests a real shift in what's motivating voters.
Yeah, I think so. And he even goes as far as to say that this U.S. anxiety could actually be a more powerful motivator than the domestic concerns in this election. But at the same time, he says the parties still need to offer concrete plans for those domestic issues, even if they are presenting them within this context of U.S. economic uncertainty.
And the thing is, that uncertainty has real economic consequences. The OECD, they actually cut Canada's growth outlook by more than half, and they say it's because of the tariffs. So it just shows you the economic weight of this and how it directly impacts those domestic concerns like affordability. It's all connected, and it all comes back to that U.S. relationship.
Right. So where does all this leave the election as we head into the campaign? Our sources are saying it's a race too close to call. The Conservatives have lost that big lead they had. What happened?
Yeah, it's been described as a stunning reversal in the polls. And Coletto, he says it's a perfect storm of factors. So first you had Trudeau's resignation, which wasn't very popular. Then you had the Liberal leadership race, which added more uncertainty. But the biggest thing, he says, is Trump being back in the White House. That seems to have energized Liberal support and shifted the whole narrative of the election. He's saying that's the main driver.
And now you've got the candidates trying to define each other based on that U.S. factor. Carney's trying to paint Poilievre as Trump-light, like their ideologies are similar, and Poilievre's trying to say Carney is just like Justin, tying him to those past Liberal policies. So the fight for the narrative, for who can handle the U.S. the best, is a huge part of their strategies.
Yeah. And both campaigns have their strengths, right? The Conservatives, they've got this really fired-up base that wants change. They've also got this well-funded machine. And the Liberals, well, they seem to have the upper hand on the narrative right now. That's what's moved the polls in their favor.
And what about the other parties? It seems like they're not playing as big a role this time around. The NDP, their popularity has taken a hit, and their leader, Jagmeet Singh, he seems to be focusing his attacks on Carney, calling him a protector of billionaires and big business.
And the Bloc Québécois leader, Blanchet, well, he's focused on protecting Quebec, especially their businesses and workers who are being hit by those U.S. tariffs, like in the aluminum industry. There's also the potential for that east-west energy pipeline to become a campaign issue, which could really shake things up regionally.
Yeah, that's always a potential powder keg, isn't it? So looking at all this, it's a pretty uncertain picture, and the race is really tight. Now, how about we shift gears a bit and talk about how Canadians actually vote? I mean, the election process itself.
Okay, so Canada uses a first-past-the-post system. So in each of the 343 electoral districts, they're also called ridings, the candidate with the most votes wins that seat in the House of Commons. And it's important to remember, people are voting for their local representative, not directly for the prime minister. The party leader whose party wins the most seats, that's who usually becomes prime minister.
Right. And to have a majority government, a party needs at least 172 seats out of those 343. If no party gets that many, then you get a minority government, which means they need the support of other parties to pass laws and stay in power. That can make things a lot more unpredictable, right?
Yeah, definitely. And during the campaign, the current government, even with Carney as the new PM, they become a caretaker government. Basically, they focus on the essentials, and they don't make any big policy decisions that could be seen as trying to influence the election. And it's interesting to think about the experience level here. I mean, Carney's never run a campaign before, and Poilievre's a seasoned pro. That could really make a difference, don't you think? And the way they're handling media access, that's another interesting tactical difference.
All right, so to wrap up this deep dive, let's recap what we've learned from your sources. The U.S. trade war and Trump's rhetoric are having a huge impact on this election. It's shaping the campaigns of both Carney and Poilievre, who have very different approaches to leadership and to that U.S. relationship. And it's overshadowing a lot of the usual domestic concerns. And right now, the race is incredibly close, and the outcome is anybody's guess.
It really is an election unlike any other. I mean, Canadians are being forced to think about some fundamental questions. Their sovereignty, their economic future, their place in the world, especially with their biggest neighbor being so unpredictable.
So here's something to ponder. How will the outcome of this election, no matter who wins, ultimately change the long-term relationship between Canada and the U.S.? What are the possible scenarios, the good and the bad? And how could this impact North America and the world?
It's a defining moment for Canada, and I think we all need to keep following the news and analysis as this election unfolds. The decisions made in these next few weeks will have long-lasting consequences, not just for Canada, but for their relationship with the U.S. and for their place in the world.